I am, as has already been said, Claire Wilbert. I'm an associate with Bernstein and Associates NAGPRA Consultants, and I first joined Bernstein and Associates back in 2015, and then rejoined the very beginning of this year after a hiatus. And I will pass it off to my colleague Jane.
Hi, I'm Jane Richardson. I've been with Bernstein Associates for about two and a half years now, and I absolutely love this rewarding work, and I'm just really, really happy that you're allowed me to speak and to listen to everyone else's discussions and thoughts about our panel. Thank you.
And Sarah.
Hi, good evening. My name is Sarah O'Donnell. I'm an archaeologist and I serve as the NAGPRA coordinator for the Osage Nation under the direction of Dr. Andrea Hunter and the Osage Nation Historic Preservation Office. Thank you.
Emma.
Good evening. I'm Emma Noffsinger. I work at the National Museum of American Indian. I'm a museum specialist in collections, and what that basically means is I am a grant-funded employee. I was hired for the Community Loans Program, and my role on the program is to work with collections management and facilitate collections access.
And Jen.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jen. I'm a curator and associate professor of cultural anthropology at the University of Colorado Museum of Natural History.
Thank you. And we'll go ahead and get started. Jane?
So some of the key questions we want to address and discuss throughout the panel is how can meaningful consultation be conducted in a virtual space? What are some of the advantages and drawbacks to virtual consultation? And what role will virtual consultation continue to play beyond the current environment post-COVID?
And so without getting too bogged down in all the details, we did want to highlight, since what Jane and I do for our clients is we spend quite a bit of time helping them plan and prepare for consultations. And so we wanted to highlight some of the ways in which our work has shifted as we've moved from primarily focusing on planning in-person meetings to virtual ones. And so one of the things that has become very apparent is that when we plan for in-person meetings, we start way in advance. Asking folks to commit to multiple days, that's a big ask. And so we try to give everyone as much time as possible to prepare and block off that time on their calendar. So we start establishing a meeting date, we book lodgings, think about blocking out a block of rooms at a hotel so that everyone can be there on site and ready to go. Thinking about meeting venues, catering. We often, provide assistance to our clients as they're working with tribes to make all the travel arrangements, flights, making sure that folks are able to get where they need to go. And then also, preparing all the meeting materials, draft documents, catalogs, all of that work that goes into making sure that everybody has what they need to be engaged in the meeting itself. And then thinking about note takers, sometimes if it's our client's first consultation, we'll want to train them, let them know what to expect. And then throughout all of this, we're coordinating and communicating and making sure that everybody is receiving all the information that they need. And then, of course, there's the meeting itself and traveling to and from, all of the on-site preparations, those things that can't be done ahead of time, setting up rooms, moving collections if they're going to be examined in a space that's not where they're housed most of the time, and then actually participating in the meeting itself before we all head off to our normal lives and do all the traveling back to where we're from. And then all of the follow-up, going through notes and making sure that action items are followed up on, planning for future meetings, things of that sort. The work doesn't end with the meeting itself. And then Jane, I'll pass it off to you to contrast that to our virtual process.
So our virtual process, it's noticeably a lot shorter with the planning of the meeting, since there's really no need to arrange for transportation or locations or travel to and from the museum or having to arrange meeting spaces. So the planning of the virtual meeting still consists of establishing a meeting date and mostly more focused on confirming preferred video meeting software with travel reps if they prefer Zoom or Microsoft Teams or Google Meet, and acquiring a recording transcription software, and also then developing and distributing meeting materials, which is much shorter, which would usually just include the agenda, participant list, the inventory summary documents, and alternatively, depending on the amount of documentation we want to share with travel reps, we will either send it as an email, but depending on the size, we'll also look into just uploading them to Dropbox or Google Drive so they always have access to it. And if we're ever updating it, we can let them know they can, rather than send them emails with attachments of those documents. So it's been really helpful. And then with the meeting part, most of what goes into that is just participating in meeting via a video conference platform, and then asking for permission to record the meeting in order to develop a full transcription of consultation notes. And so the follow-up of those meetings, just similar to Claire's steps, are developing the draft notes, and then sending them to the client for review, and sending them to the travel reps for review, and then distributing them to all the invitees. So it's a lot more succinct than everything that goes into planning for in-person. Okay.
Oh, sorry. And so, one of the really interesting things that we've noticed as we've sort of helped our clients make this shift from planning for in-person meetings to virtual meetings is that the way that the budget is being used has shifted. I mentioned all of those logistical issues that have to be accounted for when you're planning for in-person meetings. Sort of everything that comes under this umbrella of travel, per diem, mileage reimbursement, there might be flights, hotels, all of those costs that you have to account for in-person, you don't necessarily for virtual. And then also considering the costs that go into preparing materials for in-person consultation, pages of documents, printing, binders, making sure everybody's got pencils and notepads, all of those things aren't really a consideration when it comes to virtual consultation. But instead, what we're seeing is that there's a lot more person hours that are going into planning for virtual consultations. And some of this has to do with making information accessible. If you were counting on an in-person consultation that would involve bringing tribes together to review a collection, well, how do you make a collection accessible for virtual review? That might mean digitizing different or additional data, maybe photographing collections, things like that take up a lot of time. And then also you might be planning multiple meetings. Maybe there's monthly meetings instead of one big multi-day meeting. And so each of those, even though it's potentially a shorter meeting, has the same prep and follow-up cycle. And then the other thing to consider, and Jane touched on this a little bit, is the costs associated with technology. There's a lot of software now that we're all using to make sure that we can connect virtually. Some of it's free, but then what happens if you want to use Zoom for more than 40 minutes? What is your institution using in terms of its technology? And one of the things that we noticed early on when we were helping clients make this shift from in-person to virtual was that there were often hardware upgrades that they needed to make. You know, we were working with clients who maybe only had one laptop for their collections work and it didn't have a camera. So how do you engage without the right technology? So those are some sort of startup costs that, you know, now that we're well into this new virtual world, you know, most of those may be taken care of, but it's definitely something to consider. So just the different ways in which resources are spent between in-person or virtual consultation. And one of the things that we've really noticed, and I think this is one of the things that I'm really hoping other folks will speak to when we open this up later for discussion, is we've really seen a shift in working with our clients in the ways in which this pivot to a virtual world has opened up new avenues for engagement and different ways of connecting with and consulting with tribes that weren't necessarily possible or feasible in the before times when we were working on bringing people together for days at a time. And so what we've noticed, and we have 3 different case studies that we'll talk about, is just the ways in which virtual connection has opened up new opportunities. And so the first case study, this was a large-scale intertribal consultation that we were actually helping a client prepare for when COVID hit. And so we worked with them to pivot mid-project from planning an intertribal consultation over multiple days to planning multiple smaller consultations over a series of months that culminated in one full day. And so this project, what we were helping the client do was bring together a number of tribes to review a large archaeological collection. It's a site that had been excavated over a couple of decades, so a bunch of data. And the goal was to bring everyone together to review the collection in person and identify items that would be claimed under NAGPRA. So a big part of this shift was trying to help everyone wrap their heads around a site's worth of data without the collection. And so the client and the tribes sat down over months, worked together to bring all the data into a single unified spreadsheet, was what we ended up doing, and reconstructing the site digitally so that when we all sat down for this one day, they could review the data in any number of different ways and still be able to identify items. One of the really cool things that came out of this was that a much larger number of tribes who were invited, who may not have been able to commit multiple days, were able to attend. Not necessarily every meeting, but some of them. And so that there was a much broader range of tribes who were able to consult. Also significant time savings. You know, this would have required tribes to drive all day, 2 days to come together. And so it meant that they didn't have to do that, which everyone was very thankful for. You know, the downside that we found was that not being able to physically get together and review a collection, you know, it made it harder to sort of readily answer some of the questions that came up. You know, when you only have the data and when it's old site catalogs and things like that, you know, it's incomplete data. And so there were questions that probably would have been very easy to answer if we'd all been sitting together in person, that we had to then, you know, work with the collections manager at the repository. And, you know, it was sort of asynchronous communication, and it took a longer time to get answers that probably could have been answered immediately. For our second case study, this was actually a whole new experience for me. One of our clients reached out and asked if we would be willing to facilitate a tribal working group meeting. Group of tribes was planning on an in-person consultation at this museum, later. This still will happen after things are safe for everyone to travel and get together in person. But in advance of that, this working group wanted to get together, review the summary, and use this as an opportunity to prepare for in-person consultation and refine the list of items that they would be interested in viewing in person. And we said, absolutely, of course, we'd love to help. And so we facilitated this meeting in which tribal representatives, they looked at images, they were able to have internal discussion because of the beauty of Zoom breakout rooms where they could discuss these items themselves. And one of the really cool things about the virtual space was that there are no travel restrictions. So these were large groups of elders who otherwise wouldn't have been able to travel. It would have required them to travel halfway across the country. And they were all able to sit down and provide immediate information to their NAGPRA representatives who would be traveling. And it all provided a guide for future consultation. They're still planning on all getting together in person, but with this refined list of items that they want to discuss. This was definitely a situation in which the reliance on technology, the problems involved in that, were very apparent. This was a situation in which internet connectivity issues were rampant. It made communication much more challenging. There's all of the things that we're now so used to. Hey, you're on mute. Oh, wait, where's the camera pointed? All of those things definitely made it more challenging and slowed things down. I've certainly become much more mindful of how technology, it's wonderful until it's not. And this was one of those cases where I think it made the communication much more challenging. And with that, I will pass it off to Jane.
So for this third case study that we're going to talk about is we were working with a museum, and throughout NAGPRA implementation, the museum felt that was best to host monthly meetings to the tribal nations that were residing in the state as they implement NAGPRA. And we found that throughout these monthly meetings, the museum would provide progress reports on ongoing NAGPRA cases and inviting the tribes to comment or just to at least be aware of any changes that were happening. And the meetings were always recorded. So not always recorded, but they were, during COVID, they were recorded. And so full transcriptions of the conversations were made available to the tribal reps who couldn't attend. And then there was there's always an ongoing process of addressing NAGPRA-related matters that actually resulted in the museum creating a NAGPRA advisory committee with some of the tribals as committee attendees. So they would always be, even throughout the NAGPRA process, if the museum completed the compliance with other related issues, the tribal rep would still have that relationship of always commenting and just addressing and advising what the museum should do should something else happen. And there's always that transparency that started to develop in that relationship. And with the monthly meetings, there's also the creation of a NAGPRA website that the museum created, so that they included status reports on the repatriation processes for different ancestors and provided the tribes another way of monitoring progress, making decisions about their levels of involvement and how involved they want to be. And during these meetings, there was a shift from never really recording the meetings and just handwriting the notes, but it was pre-pandemic, to then always recording the meeting, which is a lot more helpful, because as I was sort of pointing out earlier, these monthly meetings, by creating a space for ongoing communication, relationship building, and transparency, even if travel reps couldn't attend because they're always busy, they will always have access to be included in the conversation in multitude of ways, such as the full transcription notes, or even the recordings, or even the museum's NAGPRA website. And so with the meetings, we also have availability polls. So that would ensure flexible dates and times. So the majority of invitees could attend these meetings, which was very helpful because travel reps are incredibly busy and they're jumping from one meeting to the next. And a lot of times they would say, I have to go to my next meeting, which is a lot more helpful being virtual than in person, where they have to block out their whole schedules to have an in-person consultation. And the option to record a meeting also allows people to be more present than having to write down word for word what everyone is saying, and then comparing notes with other note takers to complete a finalized documentation notes document. So while you can record meetings in person for in-person consultations, I feel that it's much more difficult because speakers can be more spread out, and some people speak more loudly or more softly, and I feel that having to tell people whether to speak more loudly or clearly will just disconnect the conversations that are going on. And so having just a recorded meeting on a virtual space just ensures that everyone is present in the room and in those discussions. But some of the issues that we've encountered with virtual meetings is that there's a large amount of time dedicated to transcribing meetings. So a lot of times, maybe it was an hour and a half, and creating a full transcription would take 2 to 3 hours per consultation. And also finding a preferred video conferencing platform. So there have been some issues where some travel reps aren't able to access Zoom, which is the preferred one that we use. So for security reasons, so there's always having to find an alternative solution of whether they can access it via website without logging into the software, or finding their preferred video platform, maybe it's Microsoft Teams. But one thing to always note is, if for a museum, if you are going to do virtual consultations, ask to see if your organization already has a subscription to Zoom or Microsoft Teams or Google Meet, just so that you're prepared to ask the travel reps, we use this one, which ones do you prefer, or will this work for you? And another issue of why we were first hesitant about recording meetings was the Freedom of Information Act requests, so FOIA, in which any person has the right to request access to federal agency records or information. And public institutions tend to be subjected to FOIA, so we wanted to protect information that was gathered during consultation. And we were worried if we had museum had the recording or full transcripts of these consultations, could they be subjected to FOIA? But we found that by marking all of our consultation of documents as drafts, they are protected from FOIA as long as they have the draft watermark and are listed as drafts. But there should just be a discussion with museums and travel reps on what should and shouldn't be kept within the consultation notes. I know that when we record, we don't record the opening or closing prayers at the request of the travel reps. It's just something to be aware of, and to always ask to make sure you're both on the same agreement of what is going to be written down and kept in possible perpetuity. But that's all I have to say, and with that, I will hand it off to Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to speak a little bit about my experience as a tribal representative, now having feels like in some unknown amount of time during the pandemic, conducting a lot of participating in a lot of virtual consultations. Case in point, right now, I'm coming to you all from Pawhuska, Oklahoma, the capital of the Osage Nation. And certainly, what I'm going to be speaking of is just my experience as one tribal representative. But to make virtual consultation meaningful, I think the best thing, Claire and Jane just went over kind of the logistics of it. The best thing to keep in mind is really the same principle as an in-person consultation, which is that consultation is meant to be an exchange and therefore a very collaborative process. And so to set up a virtual consultation that is meaningful from the onset, there should be an understanding and an assumption that you will have a lot of communication on the front end before you enter a Zoom room or enter a meeting in Teams or on AirMeet. The logistical side of it actually is almost can be more daunting than the traditional meeting, which does require logistics in terms of how to physically get people in one spot. But there are a lot of the same questions that I see over and over that really sometimes are left out of the virtual side of things. I think oftentimes we just try and use transparency as kind of our guiding word, our guiding theme for consultation, and try and be clear about our expectations for transparency. But there needs to be early on, as these virtual consultations are being set up, a questioning of what the goals are, not only the goals of the meeting as a museum or agency representative, but the goals of the tribes. There's not a tribal representative showing up to any consultation meeting with absolutely no idea. We all have goals and we all have jobs and we all have a lot of work to do. So understanding those goals actually is a really good way to start a conversation on the expectations of any virtual consultation. And as kind of was spoken about earlier today, if there are any internal procedures or tribal ordinances or tribal laws that need to be adhered to in setting up a virtual consultation. Because oftentimes, I know on the museum side of things, it feels a little different, but if people are representing a federal agency, you are now speaking in a government-to-government manner with sovereign nations, and virtual consultation is still consultation. So we need to be really careful and again, transparent, a word I assume I'm going to repeat about 1 million times, about what we want to accomplish in these sorts of formats. If it is easier, I've found sometimes it's easier to communicate that in terms of deliverables. What are we wanting out of this particular meeting? If we don't reach that deliverable from this virtual meeting, do we have the option to just schedule more virtual meetings so we can meet those goals together? Are there particular timelines? Claire and Jane spoke a little bit about the complete shift in their planning timelines for, putting together something like this. On my side of the table as a tribal representative, my schedule now is packed even more than ever before with all of these virtual meetings and consultation meetings, where before you needed to get a hold of me about 3 months in advance to actually physically get me to a meeting. Now I need, almost a year in advance, not only because everyone wants this to take advantage of virtual accessibility, but because NAGPRA has had this kind of a pause in physical meetings, there is now kind of a wait list of NAGPRA that we assume that we're all going to jump right back into once it is safe. Everyone agrees that it's safe to meet in person again in large groups. And then I think the ability to provide all of that associated documentation that Claire mentioned at the beginning is a really important element of the very beginning of planning a virtual consultation. I think this kind of as an aside is where I would mention, especially for folks representing federal agencies or state agencies with federal money, Executive Order 13175, which gives guidelines for consultation with tribes. And it's pretty specific in that EO that agencies cannot impose costs to tribes to participate in consultation. And sometimes with these virtual consultation, because it seems very easy for us to all click a link that magically appears in our email, folks kind of forget about the costs associated with NAGPRA consultation. So if there is a huge amount of associated documentation that is virtually being sent to me, now we share it through some sort of secure file share, or someone physically mails me a flash drive, which I love. Or at least the Osage Nation Historic Preservation Office, is now having to incur the costs of printing all those materials, creating binders, and that is not only the material cost, but the time that now I'm having to set aside to organize that information in a way, because we need the physical documentation for my office. We need the physical documentation as well as any of these digital files. So we, if I lose that flash drive that someone mailed me, I no longer, I'm up to date on all of the supporting documentation that accompanies a NAGPRA collection in whatever format that may be. The best way I have found to communicate about virtual consultation to make sure that it's actually successful is to consider consultation almost done the way that we do Section 106 consultation, which is there's a government to government formal consultation, and then there's kind of a staff to staff consultation that happens before, during, and after as well. And to try and figure out exactly what is a reasonable meeting length now that we have, moved from, keeping a group of people stuck in one room all day versus we have now an option under virtual consultation to just pop back in and out. Everyone can leave separately for lunch. It doesn't seem necessarily as tiring, but if for those of you that have stuck with us all day, it can be very tiring to just sit in front of a computer all day. And then also, I mentioned all of that documentation, having some sort of understanding that you'll have to reach out kind of on a staff to staff level and ask, how do you want all of that associated documentation? Do you want to create one master Excel database, like Claire mentioned, where everyone can access it during the meeting? Or should I be getting, a flash drive in the mail? If that's the case, I need that flash drive at least 2 weeks in advance, because now I have to go through all of that data to prepare for the meeting itself. Whereas before people would send us binders in advance or have them ready for us. We really want to make sure that any NAGPRA collection documents get to us as soon as possible, because as I told you, or as in my experience right now, I have so many people trying to take advantage of a virtual consultation style that I talk to multiple museums in a single day. Whereas before, I had that day kind of siloed for that one consultation meeting occurring physically at that museum. That's a lot of information to keep in my brain. I can't speak for everyone, but it is a little daunting. So I want that information as much of it and as soon as I can get it in my hands. Another aspect that I have seen folks not necessarily remember, because most of the invitations are coming through email, and you see in the meeting invitation, who all is invited. We're not getting a lot of agendas and attendee lists. We really still need all of that information in advance so we can make sure that all the appropriate representatives are at the meeting. As I mentioned, maybe this is more of a meeting that staff to staff, we can handle the consultation. There are other meetings for different collections at different kinds of institutions where I need to be there, my director needs to be there, as well as elders from the Osage Nation. Those are wildly different preps for me, even if we're doing it in the virtual world instead of an in-person world. And day of, there is always something going to go wrong with technology. Again, those costs that the tribes are having to deal with right now, that everything has been shifting to the virtual format, is our IT department is completely underwater. If I have a problem, it's going to be very hard for them to get to me right now, given that they have to respond to everyone else that works for Osage Nation government, which is hundreds of people. And, you know, if there is any way possible to have a designated IT support day of that the tribes are not responsible for, that to me is incredibly helpful and actually, you know, helps everyone have kind of a sigh of relief that we have a designated person to call or text or email in that moment when no one's microphones work, or, you know, the power goes out because there's a giant storm or things like those natures. And I think for us as well, I also have seen we haven't been able to as easily in the virtual format call for a tribal caucus. And that's something that I've really missed being able to do. You know, not to be glib, but to be able to kick everyone else out of the room so the tribes can speak about something that maybe we just learned in that meeting. It's a lot more difficult to do that virtually because we need to know who is hosting the meeting, who has control as a speaker of the meeting, how do we get 5 people off of the meeting, and then do we trust that when I actually don't know if they left or not? It's very difficult to do that in a virtual format. So what we have asked is almost to assume or plan, you know, again, in that early staff to staff kind of logistics phase of planning a consultation, if we need a tribal caucus, what do we do in that moment, and who would be in charge, and how do we facilitate that? That's been really helpful. Another kind of day of issue that we've come across oftentimes, these larger consultation meetings, people very graciously, especially if they have the funding to do so. And again, also, I think it's an important part of the expression of respect and hospitality that needs to be there when you're talking to tribal representatives about a subject as important and sensitive as NAGPRA, as you know, providing rooms for people to stay, providing food. I've seen people, you have all this money for a big meeting, now it's virtual, what do we do? People have mailed us gift cards to restaurants, which is that's so gracious of folks, and I really appreciate it. I would again ask everyone to remember that a lot of the tribes, at least that I consult with on a normal basis, might be based in rural Oklahoma, for example, and I don't have any of your city restaurants. I don't have any of that. So if you send me a gift card to Starbucks, which is a very nice gesture, and please continue to do that, I do appreciate it. I actually can't use that until I drive an hour away from where I live, maybe on the weekends. So it is a lot more helpful to, when planning a consultation meeting, ask, we would like to provide everyone lunch. Is there a way to get that done in your town or wherever you physically will be for that virtual consultation? And that's a question that I think everyone would be quick to answer because we all know exactly where we want to have lunch every day. And in terms of the limitations, you know, as I mentioned, if we're being clear and transparent about our expectations and how we want to make each of these consultations, because every single one is going to be different depending on the case, depending on the institution, depending on the collection. You know, if we acknowledge those limitations, maybe we can kind of correct for them either on the front end or even after the meeting in kind of an action item list or follow-up. But for me, the technical capabilities, there's kind of 2 tiers to it. You know, I don't know if you can hear the thunder. One part of it is certainly the technical capabilities of the participants of the consultation meeting. Is there hardware limitations? Is there software limitations? I do know the IT department here at Osage Nation is very concerned about the security. As the information technology experts for a sovereign government, we have very high security standards, and some of the platforms, some of the file sharing platforms, I cannot participate in, and I have no intention of participating in. That's something we need to know right up on the front. But kind of conversely, I've noticed in terms of, you know, conducting
Well, I think we may have just lost Sarah. So let's see. As Sarah Glass just pointed out in the chat, this is a perfect example of some of the limits of technology. And so I think while we hope that Sarah's able to rejoin us, I'll have Emma go ahead and step in and begin her section. And then hopefully we can bring Sarah back in a moment.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen. I have a few slides to share. All right. So good evening. Again, I'm Emma Noffsinger, and I'm here with Jen Shannon. And we're here to talk about how the NMAI is looking at virtual engagement around collections. Before we jump right in, I want to give a little bit of some context. NMAI, as you probably already know, is an extremely large institution. We have a lot of different departments that work with collections and tribes, as well as Indigenous communities in Latin America. So when we are thinking about virtual engagement, we're thinking about how it could work for everyone at our institution. So specifically, we are centering our discussion around the CRC. We're not going to talk today about what our education staff and visitor services staff are doing. That's something kind of different. We're going to focus on the virtual engagements that will happen at the CRC. So what exactly is the CRC? For those of you who maybe haven't visited us before, we are one of 3 buildings. The CRC is the Cultural Resources Center. And
Emma,
yeah,
really quickly, if you're intending to share your PowerPoint right now, we're not seeing it. I think we're just seeing your screen.
Weird. Okay, sorry. Let's try this. Can you see this?
Yes, there we go.
Okay, sorry about that. So yeah, the CRC is the Cultural Resources Center. This is where all of collections is housed. And you can see in the aerial view, collections are in the curved part of that nautilus shell shape. And at the center core of that shell shape is our entrance, as well as our archives and library space. And as you can see with these images, our building it's not simply a warehouse. It is meant to be a home for collections, as well as a gathering space. There's a lot of intentionality built into the design of the building to make sure visitors feel welcome here. And so as we're thinking about virtual engagement, that's one of the things that came to our mind right away, is how can people feel welcome in a virtual environment the same way they might feel welcome at the CRC. It's here at the CRC that we host a lot of events related to repatriation, but also loans to tribal museums and cultural centers, collaborative conservation, and Native and Indigenous artists, scholars, and community members wanting to do research on the collections we have here. Prior to the pandemic, the majority of these activities and events would happen in person at the CRC. We are located right outside of Washington, D.C., so all these in-person events meant that people had to travel. And as a lot of us have experienced, the pandemic has completely changed the way we think about travel, and therefore the way we do our work. In response to the pandemic, the Smithsonian as a whole have put forth some restrictions on travel. So right now it's not even an option for most of our activities. Repatriation is one of the things that we can do, but a lot of other activities are not available to us right now. But more importantly, we as a staff understand that the pandemic has and will continue to have a great impact on how people feel about traveling and how people feel about hosting people who travel. So it's for that reasons that we felt like it was really necessary to start thinking about virtual options. And why we haven't in the past, one reason is for all the reasons that are popping up in the chat about connecting and wireless and internet. That continues to be an issue, but also just technology comfort level. Prior to the pandemic, most of us as staff didn't really use video conferencing ever. If we did, it was on a very like ad hoc or upon request kind of situation. But since most of us had to go into extended telework, we've all gotten really comfortable going on virtual platforms. We use Teams and Zoom quite a bit. And that has made us feel more comfortable talking about a more permanent option to virtually engage with collections. So with that, in December of 2020, we formed a working group around virtual engagement. We quickly defined our scope as collections-focused visits that are facilitated digitally through online platforms, and we fully intend these engagements to have a live feed of collections. So we're not sharing images of items. We will have items right on camera, on screen, if it's appropriate. We imagine our virtual engagements would include repatriation consultations, if and when appropriate, loan selection work sessions, conservation treatment consultations, collection stewardship and record enhancement, collection reviews, exhibit planning and development, collections online consultations, as well as research appointments with Indigenous and Native artists, scholars, and community members. And so it was really important that this working group include folks from all those departments. Like I mentioned, we're a large institution, so sometimes when we have these initiatives, they can be pigeonholed into one department, and then you get multiple departments trying to reinvent the wheel instead of working together. So it was really, really important to us that we tackle this together and not separately in our niche departments. So in one of our first things that we did was we gathered together and we just did a brain dump onto a Microsoft whiteboard. If you have experienced or have used whiteboard, it's you'll know it's really fun to use. It's similar to Google Jamboard, and essentially it's like virtual sticky notes. So you can just pop your ideas on there and you can color code them and rearrange them. So as a group, we just did a brain dump of all of the things we had envisioned and all of the challenges we might foresee coming our way in order to achieve that vision. And after that meeting, I went through and just kind of organized them and color coded them into this informal project plan. And I'm not going to go through everything that's on this board for the sake of time, but I do want to highlight a few challenges we identified and what our vision for solving those problems are. The first, which has been mentioned by my other panelists already, but I think it's always interesting to see how each different group is kind of thinking about this and working through it. So technology is a huge piece of virtual engagement. And as has been mentioned in the chat, internet, and as we experienced, internet is a love-hate relationship. Externally, we know that not everyone has internet in their homes, and not everyone has internet that can support video conferencing. So if we wanted to partner with folks, we didn't want that to be a limitation. So we tried to start brainstorming, what can we do or how can we support folks in finding a more reliable source. And our idea right now is to partner with tribally owned or community owned entities such as tribal museums or cultural centers. Tribal colleges have come up a lot, but also other schools, as well as tribal libraries, and even hotels, resorts, or casinos that have conference rooms that we can rent out. This would be a great way to partner and support tribally owned businesses. And the idea is that these locations would also have the tech support. In an ideal world, we'd love to be able to support a tech support person, but it might be kind of challenging to do that. But for now, we're hoping to kind of establish a partnership hub almost, where we can pay for some services to set folks up with what they need. And then internally, we actually have a lot of Wi-Fi issues. Like many museums, we have high ceilings, we have a lot of metal in the collections, compactors, shelving is made of metal, as well as reinforced floors. All of that can impact our Wi-Fi signal. But we have a pretty unique challenge as well. We have a military communications tower in our backyard, sending microwaves that interfere with our internet. So our solution for our internal struggles is we already did a walkthrough with our IT department to identify our dead zones and either plan around those dead zones or one day install internet jacks, and we can hardwire ourselves if we need to be in those areas. Another challenge that we faced was technology. Internally, we knew we didn't have what we needed to do this successfully. We know we wanted some type of camera technology that would be able to show things like beadwork stitching, weaving patterns on textiles, maker's marks, brush strokes, evidence of wear. Sometimes you can find fingerprints on pottery. Those are all things that we really needed to be able to provide imaging of. And so we wanted a camera that could zoom in and focus on those sort of details. But we also didn't want anyone getting seasick while we're live streaming. So it was really important that we find a camera that could do those zoom capabilities, but also have built-in stabilizers. And then we also needed to get the associated tripods so that no one got sick on Zoom. Another aspect was our just internal staff capacity. Not everybody is comfortable with camera equipment. We're not all, YouTube influencers. So finding some equipment that would do all the high-tech things we needed, but would be low-tech enough that any staff member could just pick it up and use it. We didn't want to be tied to our IT department to make any type of engagement happen. Similarly, everyone's teleworking right now, so any little issue that comes up is a stress onto our IT department. So getting quick responses can be challenging. We also knew externally not everyone would have a computer and camera or a mic in their home. So we've been thinking again about how can we use smartphones? Is there a cable that we could send someone where they can hook their smartphone up to their television and then use their smartphone for? But again, we think that partnering with tribally owned or community-owned entities that have the Wi-Fi connection and could also have the equipment needed seemed like the most logical kind of answer right now. And then we also know that technical skill is going to vary. While as staff, we've grown more comfortable on these virtual platforms, we know that setting up a virtual engagement for the first time and using a camera for the first time in that capacity can be a little stressful. So how can we support each other? And essentially, we're planning on documenting all of our decisions that we're making in this working group, and anything we test out, we're documenting and creating sort of how-to guides on how to set it up so anyone can do it. But we're also thinking about our external partners, the people who you will be working with. Again, not everybody may be comfortable on these virtual platforms. So how can we make people feel welcome? So we're going to expand our existing welcome packs, our existing welcome packets to include orientations to these virtual platforms. These orientations will kind of go through like, okay, we sent you this random link. Now what do you do? What buttons do you press? How do you turn your camera on or off? I find that Zoom only offers videos, and if you're already having internet issues, you might not find the videos super accessible. So having a written guide can be helpful. We also wanted, again, to make people feel comfortable and welcome virtually engaging with us. I find that sometimes virtual platforms can make socializing feel a little stiff, especially if you're meeting someone for the first time. So how can we make this space feel more welcome, more personable, I guess just more human in a way. So the first thing that we wanted to do was sort of create a welcome video that's pre-recorded. As I mentioned in the beginning of my slides, the CRC is a beautiful building that was really designed and created to be a welcome space. So now that we don't have that, we felt like we could maybe record some of the elements and highlight some of the elements of the CRC and the work we do in a pre-recorded video, just to introduce ourselves prior to ourselves as an institution prior to a virtual engagement. This video is going to be super short. It's not going to be like some long documentary. We're aiming for 5 minutes. Staff are going to be the actors. So again, thinking about it being personable. We'll have the video available in English and Spanish. While our English speaking communities and tribes might already be familiar with NMAI, we are a hemispheric institution, so we do engagement with Latin America who maybe aren't as familiar with us, so it's really important to have a Spanish option. And again, the video will be pre-recorded. We plan on posting it onto our YouTube channel, so it can be texted out as a link or emailed out as a link. The next solution we thought about was to really beef up our staff biographies. For in-person visits, we always sent out a list of all the staff that were going to be present and who they were. But we wanted to kind of beef that up a little and include an image of staff. If a staff member is having issues with their Wi-Fi, need to turn off their camera, there's still a face to the voice, right? By having those bios sent out in advance. But we are also thinking of including more personal information into our staff biographies. Currently, they kind of feel like a conference biography where you're professionally introducing yourselves, but again, to humanize this virtual environment, including some information about who we are as people and not just as professionals, seems like a good idea to try. And then lastly, or not lastly, but the last thing I'm going to highlight about this challenge is we all have experienced the Zoom fatigue, and we felt like this is something we really need to incorporate, or a consideration to this we really need to incorporate into our pre-planning. We feel like it's essential that you ask a group you're planning on virtually engaging with, how long is their comfort level? How long can they sit on Zoom comfortably before they are dying to turn their camera off or get up or stretch? We think that there might be a sweet spot of about 2 hours, but it really depends on the goal of the engagement, the community you're engaging with, as well as the individual. And by 2 hours, I mean 2 hours before taking a significant break, like lunch. But before I wrap up with some pros and cons of virtual engagement that we have found, I want to give it to Jen to take the floor. As staff, we've been really exploring ways to solve our challenges, but we kept feeling like there's more out there that we could learn from. And we wanted to know what other folks are doing in the field. So Jen, take it away.
Yeah, so it's been such a privilege working with NMAI staff over the last 3 or 4 years as a consultant on a bunch of different projects. And part of that has been supporting them in the development of their virtual engagement program, largely through doing research and what I like to think of as building community around people doing this kind of work and learning together as a community. So you're not reinventing the wheel, as Emma mentioned before. So I'm just going to briefly mention some examples of folks that we've invited to do brown bag series of informal talks, and basically people have about 15 minutes to present what they've been working on, and then it's 45 minutes of Q&A from NMAI staff, and then an ongoing conversation into the future between NMAI staff and these project members. And it's really about learning together. And so just briefly, one of the projects that came and talked was the Blackfoot collaboration with Lethbridge University. They've been 3D scanning collection items in Europe. And what was really exciting, a couple things, I'll just highlight a couple things from each of these projects. One was the fact of who owns the data, right? So they actually have a Blackfoot digital library that's on Blackfoot lands. So the 3D objects are actually housed on servers on Blackfoot lands, even if the website is hosted somewhere else. And they also follow First Nations protocol called OCAP. So that's ownership, control, access, and possession. So that they provided a suggestion to NMAI staff, and I would say to all of you to take that training to think about things like that. And the really cool thing is they also acknowledge Wi-Fi is a problem. So they use, I'm going to put it in the link, I don't know exactly how it works, but this thing called Mazzy, where you can actually download the material, and they could go to cultural events and show 3D objects, even if not connected to Wi-Fi. Another interesting example, these are all chosen to be quite diverse, is GRASAC, so the Great Lakes Research Association had basically put together 20 kits that include a laptop, an audiovisual suite, Raspberry Pi, VR tech, scanning suite, and a broadband suite. And each of those backpacks are to be checked out by communities to be used on different projects. They can check out one backpack, they can check out all 20. And the idea is that communities can do these kinds of projects or even leverage access to those technologies on grants that they want to apply to do some types of work. Another one is the SNAC, or Social Networks in Archival Context Editathon. And that was basically training folks to edit the metadata for archival records that's aggregated in this SNAC platform. And that process was led by a Native Advisory Board. And then finally, the HERD talked about a program of doing artist-led training workshops using Zoom and Google Classroom. And they would actually mail kits out to the participants and then do the trainings over Zoom. And that was really exciting because, as one workshop leader said, we had beginner students complete a whole pair of Navajo moccasins through Zoom. So all of these are different examples of the ways that technology are being used in collaboration with communities. And our next Brown Bag series is actually with El Museo Textil de Oaxaca, and we're excited to talk to the museum professionals and the weavers about what their relationship has been virtually over the past year and a half. So sorry, that was super brief. I'll put some links in the chat in case people want to follow up and learn more.
Thanks, Jen. And I'll just quickly wrap us up with some benefits and disadvantages before we jump into some Q&A. So some pros, I think some folks have already mentioned some of these, but flexibility is one of them. I was hoping that I'd have a case study to share with you today. But unfortunately, the community we had scheduled a virtual engagement with had to cancel because they originally were going to gather at their museum where there was reliable internet and all the cameras and equipment you need. But they had a rise in COVID cases and had to return to a shelter-in-place order. This happened the day before we were supposed to engage, and it was really easy to cancel. I know that's kind of a downer, but it was easy to cancel opposed to an in-person visit where there's 10 million federal procurement hoops to jump through to cancel flights or hotel reservations. So it was a lot easier to be flexible if it's a virtual engagement. As a staff member, it was easier. It is more affordable, even if we are paying to support a hub with providing services such as internet or equipment. It would still be a lot more affordable for us. The cost of hotels in Washington, D.C. are always expensive, and we are not centrally located really to anyone. So flights are pretty pricey all the time as well. We also really like that virtual engagements mean less time away from family and friends and their community for tribal members. We work with a community that, it's grandmothers, it's mothers, it's fathers, and everybody has at-home commitments. that to fly to Washington, D.C. for a week really would put stress on their family, especially as it related to childcare. So not having to put that stress onto somebody is really appealing to us. We also are thinking a lot about how we're making the collections more accessible to those who can't travel. We know that we have had instances where there's been elders who are the experts that we should talk to them, but unfortunately they didn't feel like they could travel either for physical reasons or just, I mean, traveling's mentally and emotionally exhausting sometimes too. So now being able to have an option to reach those folks is a really great thing. However, there are some cons. It is a limited sensory experience. You can't smell through Zoom. You can't feel through Zoom. At the NMAI, we leave it up to the community to decide on whether or not to use things like gloves. We do the cautionary tale about pesticides and heavy metals and all that, but that is one thing that, we're constantly concerned about is, in this virtual engagement, how are people going to have that kind of intimate moment by touching and feeling something? We also, like I mentioned, these virtual environments can feel kind of stiff. So how do we make it feel more personable? And while I mentioned some things we're thinking about, a wave goodbye into a screen is never going to feel the same as a hug goodbye. It's just the way it is. And then internet accessibility is going to be required. As Jen mentioned, there are organizations like Grace Act that are exploring these kits, and we're really excited to test that out with them. And we are still thinking about those hubs, but internet will always be a requirement. There's really no way around that. And then we also know that for a virtual engagement, the collections reviews are going to have to be pretty structured. And what I mean by that is the same group that had to cancel, when they were coming in person, they'd often kind of disperse and move really fluidly and freely around the space that had their items staged. And with the virtual option, they're going to be limited to instructing us on what they want to see. They're not going to be able to kind of move as freely and fluidly around the room. And we're eager to find out how that might impact decision making, how that might impact somebody's experience with the NMAI. And then before I pass it over to Claire again, I just also want to mention that we've also talked a lot about what is the role of virtual in the grand scheme of it all. And we feel like virtual engagements are never going to replace in person. It's really an additional way to access collections. It's not a replacement for that in-person visit. While there are a lot of benefits, there are some limitations, and those can only be addressed by doing in-person visits again, at least right now with what we have available. So with that, I will thank you all for paying attention to us as we go into the evening, and I'll hand it over to Claire.
Thank you, Emma. And I think Sarah's been able to rejoin us.
Yes, I
there
have.
she is. Wonderful.
Just to underscore everything we have said today, the thunderstorm just knocked out the power to the building, just illustrating it so perfectly, almost like I planned it. So that is a constant threat, even as I speak right now. But I would like to kind of just say, after, everyone's had a chance to speak, kind of in conclusion, that what Emma just said is, I think, a really important thing to keep in mind, that this isn't replacing in-person consultation, it's providing another avenue for consultation. And that what I was right about to say was that, we really need to respect the tribe's responsibilities and the tribe's priorities when it comes to NAGPRA consultation. Because I can speak from my perspective, there are certain kinds of NAGPRA consultations and certain kinds of collections that we would never want to be handled without someone from the Osage Nation in the room, or held up to a camera, or taken a video or still photograph of, and those collections will need to wait until we can be in person. And it's incredibly frustrating and it's incredibly inconvenient, but this is our reality that we're having to deal with. And, keeping that in mind and trying to be as gracious as possible when we're all dealing with very frustrating things like weather impacting our technology and our access to the internet and, our ability to communicate. It's going to be a challenge. But I think as long as we are, in communication with each other, we try and understand everyone's perspective and ask about everyone's perspective and what our capabilities are, I think, we can really succeed in making all of these virtual consultations very, very meaningful.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And I'm really glad you were able to rejoin us. So does anyone have any questions, or does anyone want to share what their experience with virtual consultation has been like? We would love to get some other perspectives.
Are you ready for questions? We do have a question and I think a raised hand.
Oh, absolutely.
Let me bring on Shell McIntyre Brewer with her question. Shell, you're on.
Okay. OCO, I just wanted to let you know that we right now are working with the team over in Northern Ireland. And the whole reason why we connected was because of the virtual element. They have a very unique governmental situation where they have a devolved government, so their funding is not as predictable as some other governments. And so it just so happened that I was presenting at another conference that they were able to see then for free. And so I just wanted to bring up the economic realities. I know you guys brought them up, but also from the standpoint of communities, many different types of communities that just have limitations on spending. And we've been able to get so much done because I'm Eastern time zone. We have some intertribal members who are in Oklahoma. We have some that are on the Pacific Northwest coast. And then we're dealing with stuff, well, in Hawaii and then also Northern Ireland. So with all those time zones, we can actually set up meetings in cycles so that we can transfer information to one another. And that's been something that we have really discovered as being an asset as well. When you can't all get in at the same time, you get teams where we have enough people that can say, yes, it's a big part of the oral tradition, right? Where you get consensus, and then this consensus is brought to this consensus, and then we can all talk to one another. So I just kind of wanted to bring that up too. When you're dealing with so many different time zones, that's another aspect of it. And I also just really wanted to say thank you so much to Sarah for bringing up the point of some things can just wait. I think it's just a really, really important thing that's been brought up in a couple of other presentations as well. It doesn't all have to be done now. And I think we're doing a pretty darn good job considering. So thanks for your presentation. I thought it was really interesting.
Thank you. And are there other questions? So it looks like this one came through the Q&A regarding etiquette. I feel uncomfortable with the video, so I try not to use it. I was told that this is disrespectful to everyone else. Thoughts?
Well, I can take a whack at it. I can only, I certainly understand, and I am also very uncomfortable with the idea of a lens pointed at me for hours on end. However, when it comes to NAGPRA consultation, we need to have a very good idea of who is in the room, whether it's appropriate they're in the room, who is hearing the kind of information that's being transmitted amongst the parties. And sometimes, with these virtual setups, it's very easy to forward an invite to a meeting. And, I show up for what I think is going to be a very, specific NAGPRA consultation, and there's 5 interns in the room. If I was physically present, I think it'd be very evident that would not be appropriate for a NAGPRA consultation meeting, unless that had been cleared, beforehand, and we all agreed, especially if there are multiple tribes in the room with different viewpoints on it. For government-to-government consultation, if anyone's representing agencies, that is, to me, a requirement. If anyone is representing an agency, you are representing the United States federal government. I am representing the Osage Nation government. And if it's a black screen and you cannot see me and confirm who I am, that puts us in a lot of jeopardy. So I think there is certainly an etiquette aspect, but another aspect, I think very real aspect, there could be legal repercussions if we can't confirm the people who are supposed to be in this very confidential and very sensitive setting are the people that are there. So that's my perspective, and I certainly would hope the other panelists have a different one to let us know.
I have someone who has raised their hand. Kristen, I'm bringing you up. Kristen, feel free.
Okay. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So my question is kind of, I guess it's sort of a comment, but it's also a question. And all of a sudden I realized you can see my background. So we just had a consultation in Texas, and one of the tribal representatives brought up a really good point about with consultation, a lot of times, and with the virtual technology, you kind of have to mute people so you don't get mic feedback. And one of the representatives pointed out that, if you're cutting off a mic, you're cutting off kind of conversation. And, we had a facilitator sort of handling our platform. We were hybrid. So we had like some representatives in the room and then video with the people that were joining us virtually. So that's just something to be aware of too, is like when you talk about setting up parameters. And so if you're going to have to be kind of saying, to manage feedback and be able to, ensure everybody can hear somebody speaking, that, you may have to mute people, and that changes the nature of face-to-face, government to government consultation. And we didn't even expect that kind of going into it, and we had done a lot of we had kind of warned everybody at the beginning that we knew we needed to kind of mute people's mics in order for it to actually work and the people to be able to hear each other or hear the person who was speaking. And yet somebody came in and we didn't, and pointed that out. That was, I thought, a good point to make.
Yeah, I definitely think that's a limitation that's hard to reckon with. We don't want people to feel like they can't speak in a meeting when the goal is everyone gets to speak in the meeting. And there's really no way around that. The technology is such that our microphones are picking up the craziest things. Sometimes it's high-pitched frequency noises. Sometimes it's a creaky fan. We certainly understand that. And I think that if you do have someone, or you plan to have someone to facilitate and to try and address that, and to keep an eagle eye on, the feeds, or even if there was a way for people, or if a moderator to hear everyone, I don't know if that would even be possible, but a way to try and catch that when it's happening. That sort of interaction and that personal connection, that's something I know, Emma touched on it certainly, and so did the other, panelists today, that there's no way around it. that, you know, it's not going to be the same seeing my face on a computer screen as, you know, seeing me in person and being able to notice how excited I am to see you. That's all we can do. And so those sorts of things are definite limitations. And, you know, what you said when you first started talking is, you know, I don't think any of us signed up for, as part of our jobs, people to see our homes. And that is really tough to deal with. And as you're switching platforms, trying to figure out, can I blur the background? Can I not blur the background? Is it appropriate to have a fake background? You know, all these sorts of things. And that's, again, another limitation of virtual consultation that, you know, if it is to the point where it's unacceptable, then we might really have to deal with, you know, how do we figure out to shift this back into the physical world once we can all be together. And hopefully that's going to be sooner rather than later.
I just wanted to add something real quick is kind of what everyone's been talking about, in person versus virtual. And actually they can work together in really great ways, that it doesn't have to be one or the other. So let's say you have a consultation and someone goes back home and tells an elder, I saw this item. You know, you can do a follow-up, right? That's virtual, or something before the in-person, or having a whole classroom of community members, you know, listen to elders who are in the room talking about the object. So I think the other thing is that it opens up new possibilities for maintaining long-term connections too from a distance.
That's such a good point, Jen. And I think another kind of resonating, you know, effect that we're starting to see, at least I am, is now that people are wanting to figure out how do we get this collection, NAGPRA collection information, or digitize all the old field notes, or whatever the case is, people are having to physically go find those things to digitize them. And I'm getting personally, I can only speak for myself, a lot of calls saying, oh, we have additional things we need to talk about. Because whereas before, people may have based the consultation information that provided me on, you know, what they had in their documentation, now being prompted to go look for those things, or, you know, Jen, what you said, following up to, okay, I'll go take pictures of that for you or whatnot, physically encountering those collections. Sometimes that is a step that is left out at the beginning of the reinventory or summary process for NAGPRA, and trying to have to go through and digitize some of that information has led to more information being readily available for beginning of NAGPRA consultation.
Great. I have another question to show on stage. Question for Jen or whomever. Have you seen good, affordable tools for 3D tours or collection spaces, virtual reality being used in a NAGPRA consultation setting?
I haven't, so I'm going to leave that to everyone else. I'll just say that we've been talking about live streaming tours, using a gimbal, or like GoPro would make everyone want to like hurl, but you know, like thinking about different ways to make a live tour happen. That's kind of what we've been talking about. Virtual reality, it's in those kits. I think NMAI folks are going to test them out. I'll leave it to the rest of the group if they've had any experience in this. It's a great question.
Yeah, we talked about it a lot. I mean, I think that's our pie in the sky goal is to one day have that. One of our concerns, though, was just like jumping in right now to do it, was what's the learning curve for a user to experience virtual reality. We want to create something that would only a small number of people would feel comfortable using, but we also want to keep an eye on it and see what other folks are doing too, I think. And having those, we're going to test out those kits, so that will probably give us a clear answer to if it's hard or not.
I actually have a question, since this is a session about strategies for meaningful virtual consultation. I'd like to see if you all have any particular comments about what meaningful consultation means to you, and the ways that you can set up relationships to have that meaningful consultation.
I know for me, I guess with my experiences, because I work for Bernstein Associates and we work with museums and institutions to help facilitate the NAGPRA process and compliance. I think for me, it's when we always have the decision makers in the room. So when there's a consultation, the travel reps are there, the museum person who makes those the big decisions has to always be present in the consultation, and so there's always relationship building. But for it to be meaningful, I think from what I've been seeing is when our client, the institution that we are helping, doesn't necessarily need our help sometimes afterwards. Like for instance, if there's repatriation and the reburial process needs to be talked about, I've seen it to where some museums are just contacting the tribes and they're having their own consultations without us having to get involved. So that for me is then I know that they feel comfortable and the travel reps feel comfortable and start talking by themselves and reaching out to each other without us having to facilitate that. And yeah, it's almost like you're fine now for our clients, like you're good, everything's going how it should be, and I'm glad that the travel reps feel comfortable with reaching out to you now. Before you were strangers to them. So for me, yeah, that's what I'm starting to see as really meaningful, building those relationships.
And just to mirror that, I think that's what we would say the same thing. It's about building a partnership. It's about building a connection between us in DC and everywhere else in the Western Hemisphere.
Is there anyone who would like to say some final words before we close our session tonight?
This isn't a very serious note, but I know one of the issues with consulting virtually, as was mentioned, is like the backgrounds and how it can be distracting. But one of my favorite parts is when there's a distraction with someone's pet, like a dog or a cat that comes to the screen. And even though it's a distraction, it's more of like, oh, it goes like, what kind of dog do you have? What's their name? And that's always been like a welcomed one that I really enjoy. Or if someone has birds, that's really nice too. So. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. I really appreciate that because that's such a great reminder that even though we're on this virtual platform, that we're all just still people talking to people. And that's something to keep in mind. NAGPRA, given the subject is, has to be treated very carefully, very respectfully. It's probably one of the most important things that any of us will, help accomplish in our lives. That's my perspective. But, we have an opportunity and, we might find limitations within that opportunity, but I think it's all of us really want to accomplish NAGPRA and accomplish repatriation and, get work done. So even if it can be awkward at times and things don't work exactly the way we want them to work, if we're doing, what NAGPRA consultation requires, which is collaborative, exchanges, providing, holding ourselves accountable to some transparency, that we should be able to get this done, and just respecting the boundaries that we encounter along the way. I think that's going to just have to be the way we do it.
I think it's really incredible that everyone's been so open to experimenting with virtual platform, to do this work during a pandemic and think innovatively to get it done. I think is a great it's been a great way to feel more optimistic, I think, in the last year and a half plus. Just that we can connect to each other.
Yeah. Well, I thank you all so much for this wonderful session about virtual consultation and accepting the realities that come with it. It doesn't make it any easier. It just shifts the burden a little bit differently. And as long as we can all go into it, knowing what those challenges are and working with one another in a respectful way, we can still have success.
Everything bad